This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. This is one of the leading international scholarly organisations devoted to animal studies. I'm a member, and I encourage you to become one too. Membership is very reasonably priced, and if you have a university affiliation, you may well have access to funds specifically for paying membership fees. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a scholarly book series devoted to animal studies. It's currently accepting proposals and is open to work across animal studies. If you're thinking, I wonder if that includes my work, you should consider reaching out to the series editors, who I'm sure will be very happy to hear from you. Also, a quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganthused.com. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce you to the first zooarchaeologist I've interviewed for Knowing Animals. Dr Lizzie Wright is Marie Skłodowska-Curie European Fellow in the Department of Archaeology at the University of York, where she's studying Neolithic cattle husbandry. And she's also a research fellow in the Department of Classics and Archaeology at the University of Nottingham, where she contributes to a project on bear baiting in London. Lizzie is a real champion of zooarchaeology and is currently the Secretary of the International Council of Archaeozoology. Today, we're going to talk about her paper, The Aurochs in the European Pleistocene and the Early Holocene, Origins, Evidence and Body Size, which was published in Lockwood Press's 2022 collection, Cattle and People, Interdisciplinary Approaches to an Ancient Relationship, which was co-edited by Lizzie and Catarina Ginja. Welcome to the podcast, Lizzie.
Hi, Josh. Thanks for having me.
Now, I'm not certain of this, but I think you might be the first zooarchaeologist we've ever featured on Knowing Animals, and this seems like a real oversight. So could you start by introducing us a little bit to the field of zooarchaeology?
Sure, no problem. So zooarchaeology is the study of animal remains from archaeological excavations. So normally we study bones and teeth because these survive the best in the archaeological record, but we can also study other animal remains such as leather, hair, and also we have colleagues that study shells and things like that. So we study, human and animal past intertwined through the study of animal remains from archaeological excavations. So if somebody excavates a site and they uncover some animal remains, they will send them to someone like me. And there are many of us, there are thousands of us around the world. And we will study which animal species there are, what parts of the body there are. We'll take measurements to look at body size and shape. We will look at the age of the animals when they died. We will look for butchery practices, evidence of butchery and burning on the bones and teeth. And we use all of this information to kind of bring it all together and tell us about what people were doing with animals in the past and what relationships were like between animals and people in the past.
You describe some of the work that you draw upon in your exploration of aurochs as paleontological, and I suspect paleontology is more familiar to lots of people than zooarchaeology. So what's the difference between the two?
So archaeology is very much the study of humans in the past, whereas paleontology is more kind of related to kind of evolution. So paleontologists study dinosaurs. Archaeologists don't study dinosaurs. A common misconception because last time I looked, humans and dinosaurs didn't exist together at the same time. So the work that I've done on aurochs kind of crosses a little bit the boundary between these two things because for my PhD, I studied the morphological variability of the European aurochs, and I was taking measurements from aurochs remains all across Europe, and I was looking at the size and shape differences across time and space in different environments, in different geographies, in order to get a better idea about what the variation of this animal was through time and space. So that's kind of in many ways a more paleontological question or biological question, depending on what time. So paleontological stuff is mainly fossils, so tends to be quite old. And some of the stuff that I was looking at was fossilized, but some of it wasn't because it was too recent for that. The aim of the question really was to get a better idea of what the variation of the aurochs was, so that we can identify better wild and domestic cattle remains in archaeological assemblages, so we can find out about what was going on with humans later on. So the issue that we have is that wild and domestic cattle remains are quite similar in their morphology. In general, the wild cattle, the aurochs, are larger than the domestic, but there is an overlap between the smaller aurochsen and the larger cattle. And then that means that we have quite a difficult job sometimes to tell the difference, to say which ones we've got on our archaeological sites. And particularly, this is a big issue in the Neolithic period, where domesticated animals first start appearing, because some of the big questions that we're asking in archaeology is, where were animals domesticated? Why were they domesticated? What was the timing of that? And if we don't know whether we've got wild or domestic remains, then it makes it very difficult for us to answer those kinds of questions. So my project was a kind of baseline project to figure out what the situation with aurochs was, so that we can better identify wild and domestic remains in order to answer the human-based questions.
That's fascinating. So that's very much at the scientific end of zooarchaeology. But you mentioned some other areas of zooarchaeology that are relevant for thinking about cow-human interactions. And two in particular really jumped out at me. And they're social zooarchaeology and ethnozooarchaeology. So could you introduce us to those fields and tell us what they might be able to contribute to understanding this relationship?
Yeah, so social zooarchaeology is kind of slightly more recent theoretical perspective in zooarchaeology, which tries to look at zooarchaeological questions more, kind of switch things on their head, kind of more from the animal's perspective. So incorporating the animal turn, this kind of thing. And so, in the scheme of zooarchaeology, it's a relatively new thing, but more people are starting to incorporate this into their work. Ethnoarchaeology has been around for a bit longer. It's incorporated into archaeology as a whole, but also specifically zooarchaeology. But the idea behind it is that you draw on ethnography to help you to interpret your archaeological data. So you may use ethnological work that's been done by other people, or you might go and do your own field work asking specific questions with specific questions in mind in order to interpret your data. So quite a few zooarchaeologists have gone and spent time with animal herders in various different places and interviewed them about their practices, what they did in the past, how things have changed, what they do in different environments. And then they use this information to help them interpret their zooarchaeological data.
That's fascinating. So are these approaches that might be useful for the kind of interactions way back in prehistory?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is always the debate is ethnographical work that we're doing right now, how relevant is that to what was happening in prehistory? And I think that there's always an acknowledgement that we're not looking for an exact replica of what happened in the past. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to gauge what all of the different kind of options are for dealing with different situations. And then you can look at your data and you can look at the kind of contextual information you have around your data, and you can say, okay, well, these people dealt with this kind of situation like this. So maybe this kind of thing could have been employed in the past. I should say that like most of the ethnographic work that has been done in recent years on the zooarchaeological side has been trying to work with herders who still kind of use more what you might consider to be ancient methods or whatever. So it's not just go down to your local industrial pig farm and find out what they're doing with the pigs. It's go and try and find communities where they are still using these kind of methods that are from the longer past. And often it might not be that they're even doing it anymore, but you might be able to talk to someone's son whose dad or granddad might have done it, and they remember what they were doing when they were kids, this kind of thing.
So you're one of the editors of this volume, Cattle and People, along with Catarina Ginja. Could you tell us a little bit about how the book came about and some of the things it contains?
Yeah, sure. So there's a bit of a history in zooarchaeology of putting together edited volumes based on a species or a group of species. There's a book on pigs, which is very similar to this, and a couple of other animals as well. There's one on deer, but no one had done one on cattle for a very long time. There was one back in the 60s. It was called Man and Cattle. Of course, not a title that we would use now, but at the time it was quite a important volume, which kind of had chapters from all of the people who were doing stuff related to cattle zooarchaeology, and actually quite a few of the people in the book were vets at that time. Quite a lot of the earlier zooarchaeologists were vets. They came from that kind of background, and it was a really interesting volume that I read quite a few papers from when I was doing my PhD, and I always thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool to kind of recreate something like that, but like the more modern version. And yeah, we have the International Council of Archaeozoology, which is the main big international organisation that represents zooarchaeologists, fosters collaboration and communication between zooarchaeologists around the world. We have a big international conference every 4 years, and me and Cat Ginja, who's a geneticist who I've worked with in the past, we thought it would be really nice to have a session at the conference where we could invite people who are working on cattle to come and present their work, with the idea that it would be zooarchaeology, but also other areas as well. So Cat's a geneticist, so we had some papers that were on genetics. There's the ethnoarchaeology angle. We have people working on isotopes and lots of other things. Originally, the book stemmed from this conference session, which was a really, really popular session. We had a full day session, I think. It was in Ankara in Turkey in 2018, really well attended, and everybody really enjoyed it. So we thought, okay, let's do a book from it. So everybody from the conference session was invited. And then we also asked a number of other people if they'd be interested in writing chapters for the book as well, because first of all, not everybody from the session was able to contribute, but also we were very aware that there were certain gaps in geography and time and things like that. So we wanted to try to give a kind of broader picture of the kind of work that was going on cattle in zooarchaeology.
And your chapter is about the Pleistocene and early Holocene, so way back. But what sort of time frame is covered in the volume as a whole?
So the volume goes all the way through time, really. I'm trying to think what the most recent paper is. My paper is probably the earliest, and the earliest material I talk about is from 650,000 years ago. But we go right through to the post-medieval period. And one of the papers, the one on China, actually talks about the modern day as well. It kind of gives an overview through time in China.
So let me ask you a little bit about your chapter in particular. You note that cows and cattle arrived in Europe around the same time as Homo heidelbergensis, and I believe I'm right in saying that they're a direct ancestor of ours. And also at the same time as Acheulean technology, which are the hand axes, if I'm right, the kind of famous prehistoric hand axes. And you say that there are early indications of interactions between these first European humans and the Aurochs, the first kind of wild European cattle. So could you tell us about these first interactions?
Yeah, so the evidence that we have, normally it will be to do with either Aurochs remains and technology appearing on the same site together, or it will be Aurochs remains that clearly have been worked in some way. They have some butchery marks on them from tools. So obviously, if you have remains and tools just appearing on the same site, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were being exploited by humans. However, when they keep turning up on the same sites again and again, it kind of implies that there was some kind of interaction going on. But once we start to see the actual butchery, then we can be sure that there was interaction. However, we don't know exactly the nature of that interaction, whether it was that Homo heidelbergensis was hunting aurochs, or if they were just taking advantage of carcasses that were around, essentially scavenging and using their tools to just process the carcasses after they were dead already.
So how did these interactions develop, if at all, with the emergence of modern humans?
So through time, we see clearer evidence of kind of deliberate exploitation of aurochs by different human groups. Certainly by the time the Neanderthals arrive in Europe, there is definitely deliberate hunting going on. And we see this through a number of pieces of evidence. Yes, butchery, but also the kinds of assemblages that we find. So there's a number of situations that have been interpreted to have been kind of setups where human or Neanderthal groups have kind of set up a trap for large bovids where they've either gone off a cliff or they've got stuck in an area and then they've hunted them. So there's obviously like a lot of thought process going into a lot of these hunting activities, certainly by that time. And then when we get to anatomically modern humans, you start to see slightly different kind of approaches, and it kind of becomes a bit more variable in different places. And in fact, the anatomically modern humans, if I understand correctly, they were less likely to have been hunting large bovids in big groups or focusing on large bovids, and they kind of diversify a little bit more the kind of things that they are hunting, which is one of the things that makes them so adaptable. And well, some people have argued that's one of the reasons why they were more successful, in inverted commas, is that they were able to kind of diversify and adapt to different environments depending on what was available and stuff.
That's very interesting. So the hunting of the aurochs we would associate more with pre-modern humans and Neanderthals rather than anatomically modern humans.
They were still hunting aurochs, yeah. Aurochs were still hunted, but there's less evidence of a real focus on large bovids such as aurochs, yeah. There's just a more diversification of the diet. Whereas Neanderthals, it seems that there's a fair amount of evidence that there was a real focus on the larger bovids, and these kind of mass kill sites as well, where they're killing loads of them at the same time.
So this might be a question that there just isn't really an answer to, but do we have any indication of significance to this human-cattle relationship beyond food in these early interactions?
Yes. So, I mean, certainly by the time we have anatomically modern humans, we start to see cave art and other kinds of art which depict animals, including aurochs, but also other large bovids and deer and many other different species. So it's clear that there's something more going on than just these guys are our food. You also start to find kind of artifacts made out of bone and things like that, but this is something that's kind of more related to anatomically modern humans than earlier, although now we are starting to find more evidence in Neanderthal assemblages, for example, that there was more meaning than just food to these animals. I think for a long time people thought it was a very anatomically modern human thing, but in recent years there's been quite a lot more evidence that's been found that Neanderthals may have had this kind of relationship as well.
So what kind of evidence are we talking about here? Are we talking about jewellery or cave art or?
In recent years, quite a lot of the evidence related to Neanderthals has been kind of reinterpreted, and there's also been new evidence found, which has indicated that whereas in the past there was this kind of idea that Neanderthals were these kind of brutal people who just were obsessed with killing and meat and things, that obviously there was more to them than that, and there is now a number of pieces of evidence that have been interpreted to indicate that there were more relationships kind of between Neanderthals and animals and this kind of thing. And if you want to know more about that, I suggest reading a book called Kindred by Rebecca Ragg-Sykes, which came out a couple of years ago, which presents lots of the kind of more recent interpretations of Neanderthal evidence. It's a really, really interesting book.
When someone mentions aurochs, my first thought is always ancestor of domestic cows. That's kind of what's always put in brackets afterwards. So when did this kind of hunting, well, scavenging first and then hunting that you're talking about transition towards domestication? And how did that happen?
Well, these are some of the big questions in archaeology. And, many zooarchaeologists are involved in projects on these kinds of topics. So the first evidence that we have for domesticated cattle is from the Near East around 10,000 years ago. And the exact reasons why they were domesticated, we don't know for sure. There are many hypotheses that have been proposed. There are sites in the vicinity where pre-domestication, there does seem to have been some real importance placed on aurochs, We don't know if it was related to this kind of relationship that already existed, or if it was kind of a purely practical choice. I expect it's probably a combination of the two, but that's quite difficult to judge from archaeological evidence. But yeah, we do know that domestic cattle did start appearing around 10,000 years ago. And then what happened in Europe, the evidence suggests that domestic cattle themselves were kind of moved across Europe and incorporated into societies as they went. So domesticated cattle first appear in Eastern Europe, and then slowly it kind of moves west. And there's two kind of ways that domestic animals, not just cattle, but also sheep, came through, and pigs came into Europe. There was a route that kind of went through Central Europe, and there was one that went around along the Mediterranean. And the central route was more kind of cattle-based, and the Mediterranean route was more caprine, so sheep and goat-based. And there's many arguments for why this might be, and one of the strongest ones is topographical, is that goats and sheep do better on the kind of terrain that there was along the coast.
Now, before we move on to our regular questions, I just wanted to ask what might be quite a silly question, but which was on my mind kind of throughout reading your chapter, which is, what did aurochs look like? How recognisably cow-like were they? Would an untrained eye be able to say that's an auroch, that's a cow? Or are they very similar creatures?
So the biggest morphological difference between them would have been the shape of the horns. So in addition to being larger in size, aurochs had these kind of horns that kind of curved forward in a quite a specific way. And you can see some of these horns in a number of different museums around the world, but around Europe as well. And one of the best places to see aurochs remains is in Copenhagen, and the Zoological Museum. They've got a massive collection. And also in their, I think it's their historical museum in the centre of town as well, they also have an aurochs on display where you can go and see the kind of size it was and the shape of the horns. So if we find the horn cores, so the horns don't tend to survive because the sheaths are made out of the same kind of material that hair is made out of, so it doesn't really survive in the archaeological record. But we find the cores inside the horns, and we can be fairly sure, oh yes, we have aurochs. But often we don't find them. So then you're looking at sizes, basically. That, there aren't really any other morphological differences that you can look to. Obviously now, the breeds of cattle that we have their quite distinctive markings. It's possible that back in the day, you might have been able to tell the difference through coat colour, but we don't really know at the moment. It's the kind of thing that can be looked at through ancient genetics, through genomics. But as far as I know, there's not any paper that's been published so far which has said, yes, this is the coat colour for aurochs and this is the coat colour for domestic cattle.
Now, Lizzie, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, I was thinking about this, and I can't remember a particular paper, but as an undergraduate, I studied both archaeology and anthropology, and I was particularly interested in the kind of crossover between the two from a very early human perspective and very early human economy. What decisions were people making about their diet and survival? Debates around hunting versus scavenging, like we've just been discussing, and gathering versus hunting as well, and how meat-focused the early human diet really was. I think in the past there's been a big kind of, a lot of the literature has been very meat-focused, but often I think it's probably been overblown a little bit how important meat was. And so these were the kinds of topics that really piqued my interest in past human-animal relationships, and it's essentially what got me into zooarchaeology in the first place.
Oh, that's fascinating. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes, so the first paper that I had published was on the pig remains from a British late Neolithic site called Durrington Walls, which some listeners may have heard of. And this is a settlement site that is thought to have been associated with the activities taking place at Stonehenge. And at this site, there are absolutely loads of pig remains and many bones with evidence of having been cooked on a fire. So we wanted to find out more about the role of the pigs at this site, and particularly if there was any seasonal pattern to their use. So me and my colleagues, Sarah Viner Daniels and Umberto Albarella, studied the pig jaws from the site in order to find out the ages of the pigs when they died. So this is one of the most important parts of a zooarchaeological study. We record which teeth are present in the jaw, how worn down the teeth are, and we can then make predictions about how old they were when they died. And at this site, we managed to calculate that a high proportion of the pigs were being killed during their first winter, which is earlier than you would normally expect for getting the most meat out of an animal. And this seemed to fit with hypotheses that had already been formulated around the potential for midwinter feasting at the site, and which may have been linked in with activities that were happening at Stonehenge, where both the midwinter and midsummer seem to have been important. So that was my first ever paper.
Wow, it's incredible just how much you can learn or confirm from what sound like very small amounts of remains.
Yes. Yeah, although I would say that Durrington Walls has a really big assemblage, and we weren't short of data on that one.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
So from a zooarchaeological perspective, I would have to say my PhD supervisor, also my colleague and friend, Umberto Albarella, who's based at the University of Sheffield. And he's really been a mentor to me throughout all of my career, because not only is he a brilliant scholar, but he's always been a massive advocate for diversifying our field and also reflective of our place within the world. And I don't think I was the typical kind of person to do a PhD, but he really inspired and encouraged me and many others to go for it. And I'll be forever grateful for that. He's also been the main driving force behind the campaign to save the archaeology department at the University of Sheffield. And I should say that if you want to find out more about that, you can search for Save Sheffield Archaeology on Google, or there's also a Facebook page, and there's also a change.org petition.
Yeah, I echo that entirely. I'm not at Sheffield anymore, but I was until recently, and regular listeners will know that we featured lots of people from Sheffield because there's a big animal studies contingent there, and what's happening at the archaeology department there is not good. So I do encourage you to look into that and to pledge your support if you can. What's the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
So in archaeology, our main aim is to tell stories about how the animal-human relationship functioned in the past, in different places, in environments, and in political contexts. And this information is really vital for making informed choices about our relationship with animals in the future. For example, zooarchaeological work is now being used to inform rewilding and other conservation projects and stuff like that. So our work also provides a great opportunity for us to consider our place in the world and our relationship with animals more generally. How has this changed? What have we got wrong? Have we got anything right? In recent years, there's been a rise, like we discussed earlier, in social zooarchaeology, which has incorporated the animal turn into our zooarchaeological work, asking questions around the animal's perspective to past animal-human relationships. And a few months ago, some colleagues organised an excellent conference called Zooarchaeology Saves the World, which really delved into our place in the world and within scholarship and where our field is heading. So you can find them on Twitter at ZooArchSTW, and they also have a website that you should be able to find if you Google Zooarchaeology Saves the World. And there's lots of nice little videos on there about different zooarchs' perspectives of where we are and what we should be doing and how we can be changing the world.
And on the subject of changing the world, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
So I think as a zooarchaeologist, one of the things that I try to do the most is try to reflect on what our work can tell us about a human's place in the world. And that can have a massive impact on the way we think about animals. So by understanding more about the way that our relationships with animals functioned in the past, how can we consider our place in the world now? And how can that help us to change the way that we treat animals in the future?
I think that that's a really nice summary of zooarchaeology that also in many ways speaks to the kinds of goals of animal studies more broadly. And I think that it indicates really how it would be great if zooarchaeology and animal studies could become a little bit more integrated. I think it's a shame that sometimes they seem to be quite separate. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of the same questions and a lot of the same motivations motivate people in zooarchaeology and in animal studies. So what is it you're working on next?
Okay, so at the moment I'm working on two main projects. The first is looking at cattle husbandry in late Neolithic, northern and central Europe. And this is the project that's funded by the European Commission Marie Skłodowska-Curie scheme. And it's just started, so there's not much to say yet, but it's combining zooarchaeology with ancient DNA and pottery residue analysis to investigate how cattle husbandry might or might not have changed with the arrival of a series of archaeological practices attributed to a culture called the corded ware culture. And this is based at the University of York, so watch this space for info on that. So the second project that is a kind of continuing project is looking at bear baiting in early modern England. I think you mentioned it at the beginning. And this is an AHRC-funded project being undertaken across the universities of Nottingham, Roehampton and Oxford. And it's combining zooarchaeology with isotope analysis, ancient DNA and archival work in order to find out more about the lives of the animals that were involved in the horrible activity of baiting. And if you want to find out more about this, our website is boxofficebears.com.
Well, thanks for that web address, and thanks for the other connections to the various projects. If people are more interested in your work and they want to hear about your work, how can they best find out about that?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Lizzie Wright 20 or on the web pages of both the University of Nottingham and the University of York. My new project web page is not up yet, but hopefully forthcoming very soon. And yeah, like I said, you can find out about my work on the baiting project at boxofficebears.com.
Well, thanks, Lizzie. This has been a really insightful conversation. So thanks for joining us for this podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast where you found it. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.